If you've been worshiping with us over the last few weeks, you know that you would think that after 40 years, my kids would realize that I work at this time in the morning. But I just received a text. Can you believe that? And they're probably saying, "Dad, what are you doing right now?" Let me start over. If you worshiped with us the past several weeks, you know that Luke's been on a tear regarding tax collectors, or what we might call publicans. The scriptures, the Gospels being written decades after the actual fact, remember that the evangelists, the authors themselves, have an agenda. They have a story. They have an image that they wish to convey. And so they outline these stories, even though they may be similar gospel to gospel, in their own chronology, in their own flow, because the Gospels are not so much history as they are sermons. They're written to convert. That's their purpose. And as I said, Luke has been on a tear. 2 weeks ago it was the Pharisee in the temple praying, and the Pharisee says, "Thank God I'm not like this publican over here." And then last week we had another one, and this week we have Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus is not your ordinary tax collector. He's the supervisor of tax collector. He's the Uber of the tax collector. He is the goat, as we would say these days, of tax collectors. Well, over the last few weeks, we've learned, hopefully, that tax collectors are not very popular and they were not very reputable. They not only taxed people or took taxes from their own people to pass on to the Romans, they skimmed a little off the top for themselves. And everything was taxed. You not only had a sales tax and a property tax, but you had taxes on your license, taxes on your crops, taxes to pay if you crossed a river, taxes to pay if you went out of the country. There are all kinds of taxes, and I wouldn't be surprised if the publicans just threw in a couple extra for their own benefit. But as I said, as a supervisor of tax collectors, especially in the town or the city of Jericho, where it was a commercial hub where these things would be coming in from all other parts of the Middle East, it was probably a very prosperous position to hold, and not everyone would get it. And Zacchaeus probably worked very hard or finagled his way very hard to get into this particular job position. And the importance of Zacchaeus is also to be known that, and maybe you didn't catch it, but you always should, we have his name. We know who he is. The gospel writers don't just throw names in. A lot of times it's just a publican, but here we know Zacchaeus. So he may have been better known than we might at first think. I suspect he had heard of Jesus. John the Baptist lived and ministered in that part of Israel, and Jesus was down in that area. And I suspect that Jesus, after the baptism, Zacchaeus probably had heard of him too. The two are not strangers. And if you take a look at the Greek word that's used here, it gives us some flexibility in translation, because the Greek word that comes out or is translated here as Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus really implies he wanted to know who this guy is. It's not just catch a glimpse, sign an autograph kind of thing. It is, I want to know if what I've heard about this person has any true substance. And the same word is used for what Jesus is seeking. In this regard, Zacchaeus and Jesus are on the same line. They are both trying to find out what makes the other tick. Now, when I look at this, I've always had kind of an open heart for Zacchaeus. I don't think he was particularly a bad guy. I'll get to that more in a minute. But the first indication, that I take, where I get that from is the notion that Zacchaeus was honest enough with himself that he, despite everything he owned, everything he possessed, all the power and authority, whether you like him or not, he was close to the Romans. I think he detected and was willing to admit something was missing in his life, that all the other things he had accumulated just didn't fill him. He had a hole in his soul. He had a hole in his soul. And I think we can empathize with that, because in our own lives, we have moments when we have holes in our souls. And how they turn out is dependent upon what we put in them. There was an empty space that I think he sensed. An empty space. This was a man who probably didn't have very many friends. Now, having said that, I want to say something that I think is very, very, very important and often overlooked. We say Zacchaeus was a bad guy, but just because he was a tax collector didn't make him that way, right? Zacchaeus, by Roman standards, by the powers that employed him, Zacchaeus wasn't doing anything illegal. Just unethical. And that's a fine line, oftentimes, but an important one. Are the ways we think, are the ways we act, are the ways we use our position and our connections illegal? Probably not. The question is, though, are they being used ethically? And that's a much deeper question. Are they being used in a fashion that is ethical, fair for all? When J.C. Penney's opened his first store in Kemmerer, Wyoming, the slogan that he really wanted to operate by was not okay, sell a product, make a product as cheaply as you can, and sell it for as much as you can get. No. J.C. Penney said, a fair price for a fair product. It was all about treating everybody had needs, and everybody needed to take care of them and theirs, but it was not a matter of getting the maximum that you could, especially when it played on people's misfortune, but trying to do what is good for the good of all. If tax collectors or government employees were known to practice the way Zacchaeus did in our time, we'd be screaming bloody murder. We'd be out there protesting, we'd want a lot of dismissals and so forth. But that wasn't illegal or wrong, though I would admit it was unethical that they skimmed off the top. They got as much as they could. Get it while you can, right? So we have watchdogs on public servants, but how many businesses and business owners and producers act just like Zacchaeus? They operate on the same standards that, whether ethical or not, raise questions as to fairness and justice. What happens when there's even a rumor of a hurricane coming? Not only do the shelves empty, but the prices start to go up. Okay, you can say that's supply and demand, but I say it's the hurricane, taking advantage of the hurricane. Prescription drugs. How many of you like the price of the prescription drugs that you use, right? I had a brother-in-law in the business for Boston Scientific, and whenever I talked about the price of medical and how it cripples us, he said, well, the research and development costs a lot. That's the standard line. But I tell you, when the cost of the research and development is paid off, the prices stay the same. So don't tell me that. And don't get me started. You know, gasoline drives me crazy for a lot of reasons. But have you ever figured out how they figure out how much to charge? You know, you can go from one corner to the next corner and have 10 cents, sometimes recently 20 cents, a gallon difference. You know, and God help us if a war breaks out on Antarctica between polar bears, because that'll shoot it up. That's a reason to shoot it up. You know, we had someone in one of my churches who owned one of those corner gas stations. I said, how do you determine what the price of gas is? He says, well, I look at my neighbor across the street. Our for-profit society is driven by the same values and the same thinking as Zacchaeus. And in the current climate we are in, we know precisely what happens when that notion catches fire and we pass it on and pass it on and pass it on and pass it on, and things spin out of control for everybody. I don't know if Zacchaeus liked his job. I don't know how he got it. But I do think that he had a dilemma. He had a conscience. He had something that made him feel uneasy and restless. You know, this is spontaneous, but I have a very, very close friend at one time in one of my churches he literally had a nervous breakdown. He was probably one of the best liability personal injury attorneys in the state. He defended insurance companies. And what got to him, he says, you know, I got somebody who had a flaming Alaska dumped in their lap and they caught on fire. And they had justifiable injuries. And I thought they deserved this. And the insurance company is they're not getting a penny. And you see the conflict in his own mind of what's fair and what's right and what's just, and yet what society called him to do. So Zacchaeus, I sense, is kind of in that same gray area. So when he heard Jesus was coming, he had to see for himself. He had to get a glimpse of this guy. He had to, in some way, know if all the did I say that right? All the stuff he had heard was real. And when he got there, tiny little guy, too many things were in his way. People, he had to probably push and shove and so forth. And I would submit to you, those people symbolize not just, well, they can symbolize people, but so much more. All those people in his way to get to Jesus were probably of his own making. Right? They were probably symbolic of all the problems and all the things he had done that stand between him and Jesus, all the people he had alienated and the relationships he had broken or destroyed. They were all between him and Jesus. And somehow, to find Jesus, to get there, he not only had to get through all the stuff that was there, he had to climb a tree. And he had to rise above it, which means putting it aside, letting it go, and freeing yourself so you can actually see what you're searching for. On the slide above, I think this is a children's book that will remind us of what Zacchaeus was going through. Where's Waldo? Remember those? You remember those? You had to find Waldo in that mess. You had to work at it. It wasn't quick or simple. It required effort to maneuver through it all. And I think that's what Zacchaeus had to do. That's what we have to do to get an honest glimpse at who Jesus is and what Jesus says and what Jesus does. And when Jesus says, love your neighbor, there are no exceptions. How do we wade through that and make it our own? The wonderful part is that if we dare to take that risk and make that effort, Jesus is looking for us, and Jesus says, let's have coffee. Let's have coffee. And we don't have to go to Starbucks or Wawa or anything. Zacchaeus, I want to meet you on your own turf. Let's go to your home. Let's go to your home. And you know the interesting thing about getting in, pastors, we don't do it as much as we used to, home visitations, but I loved going into people's houses because there were pictures on the walls and there were all those things. When you got into their home, you really began to know who they were. Jesus says, let's go to your home. And we don't know what the conversation entailed. We don't know. That's all guesswork. But again, the Greek word translated in Zacchaeus' response to Jesus could be translated, I will give, I gave. It could be future, past, or present tense. In other words, he may have already been doing some of that stuff, and he may have changed his mind at the moment with Jesus, but he promises to do even more than he has. And I choose to believe that Zacchaeus was probably doing some of it already. It's just he's going to up the ante now because he sees things more clearly. He sees how his taking from people has hurt families. He sees how his greed has affected others down the line, people he does not even know, and he says, Jesus, I got to step up. I have to do more. I don't know about you, but when I pass a homeless person on the street, I respond like everybody else, but I'm immediately aware of the problem and the need. That's apparent. That stares me right in the face. But the question that also follows that is, I wonder how that person got to this place in the first place. What was it that happened in their life? What was it that someone did or someone took away? Or what happened that this person ended up there, and but for the grace go I? I want to know. I want to know more. It's hard for me to believe that something didn't happen. Somebody didn't take what that person needed at the right time that got them there. Yeah, they may have made poor decisions, but I also know that there are people out there making a lot of money selling drugs and other things. You see, what happened along the way that they got there? I don't know. Recently, we have been told, and I can't recall if it's the shooter at Uvalde or the one down at Parkland. I think it was Uvalde. But if I read correctly, they said that the young man suffered from FAS. Anybody here know what FAS is? Thank you. FAS is fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome, and this is one I know very up front and personal. Fetal alcohol syndrome happens when a pregnant mother drinks alcohol a lot. And the fetus then swims not in embryonic fluid alone, but in alcohol. So the brain ceases to develop during that period of time. And so what fetal alcohol babies have in common is they lack the ability to see the consequences of their decisions. They can't. They usually end up hospitalized in an institution or institutionalized in prisons. I know this because years ago my oldest brother and his wife adopted a child from, he was a Native American. The child was a Sioux of the Sioux tribe, Lakota. And they didn't know why they couldn't get this child to figure out, if you throw a ball at the window, it's going to break. It was that. And that was about the time they began to uncover this link with the alcohol and the mother and the child. And it is with great pain that my brother tried to raise the child, but he has since been in and out of jail and prison and done a lot of things that just don't make any sense. And we can say, okay, I see the problem, well, you fix it. Let's just keep him in jail, let's fix it. But it's like that homeless person. I look behind it and say, how did we get here? How did that kid get here? How did we create a system? And we know, I mean, if you study the history of the colonization and Native Americans and the 400 treaties we made and we broke, and if you've ever, like our youth, have gone to those reservations and you've seen the conditions, you see the dominoes start following. And we pay. Sooner or later, we pay. There is cause and effect. Are you following me? I think that's what Zacchaeus was wrestling with. You know, after a while, if your eyes are open, you see it's not just about me and what I take home today. It's about what effect do I have. You know, CEOs know that the best way to get good employees is to sell a product that they really believe in, that they believe makes a difference, you know. It is painful to think. You know, it's painful for me to think all the things we do because of the bottom line and not the value it has to all of us. You know, it's no different than, well, I could think of so many things. I can think of commercials and magazines, and then I think of the young women who suffer from bulimia. And what kind of a world have we created? What kind of a society? And have we allowed ourselves to see that world through Jesus, not through all the talking heads and analytics and whatever? So I have one more slide to show you. I became familiar with this slide. It was made out of three-dimensional materials in the university I attended, and it took me a while to figure out. It just looked like an ugly blob to me. But you know, I'm not very good at art, and what other people say is fine art, I don't get. So I didn't waste a lot of time thinking about it. But the story is that during the Second World War, a photographer in China, during one of the lowest times there and the conditions in that country, was making a prayer. He was a Christian. He was making a prayer and was asking to see some sign or to see some recognition of God or Jesus being with him. And he took a photo of melting snow against the side of a hill with mud. And when he looked at it, he saw the face of Jesus. Now, you may or may not see Jesus, but what I will tell you is if you work and you play with it long enough, you will. And once you see him, you will never be able to see anything else. You see, the meaningless melts away and he becomes front and center. And that's the conversion story of Zacchaeus. Regardless of how he saw life before and the way in which he responded, he could not see life the same way in the future. That encounter with Jesus changed how he saw himself, others, and the world. For as the book of Timothy says, if God is love, then wherever you meet love, you meet God. And if love is not there, God is not there. And it is that, because the word salvation from Hebrew means wholeness. It is that fills the hole in our soul that we so desperately seek. Now, before I say amen and move on, I'm going to tell you I'm going to be right here afterwards with a little sheet to try to show some people who haven't seen it, and it's going to bug them until they do, where Jesus is in that. How many people see him? Did you see it before, right away? Have you seen it before, Susan? Yeah. If you haven't, maybe you can help a person next to you. But we're going to leave it up, and you keep thinking and looking.